So let's bring in here the independent economist Warren Hogan, and also live from Washington, Professor Stephen Hamilton at the George Washington University. Can I start with you, Stephen? And that is, go to you and basically ask the question. I mean, yes, the government's going to deliver a budget. Yes, it's going to show ongoing deficits. But the reality is that government spending, along with revenue, has really taken off. This is almost a record government in terms of recent memory for spending.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's a lot of talk about two surpluses in a row. There's a lot of talk about budget responsibility, but there's two numbers that I think sum everything up. The government's currently forecasting a $27 billion deficit this year, as you said. Since it came to office, it has taken decisions. So this has nothing to do with, good news, bad news. This is active decisions by the government that have worsened the budget position by $21 billion. So if the government hadn't taken those decisions, or if the government had offset those decisions with savings or with new revenue, it would have been running, almost a balanced budget, right? So almost the entirety of the deficit we see is due to things they've chosen to do. So I can't look at that and say, this is a government with good fiscal prudence.
It's interesting, Warren, isn't it? Because one thing that I seem to observe, I don't know whether anybody else spots this, but every time the Prime Minister seems to go out somewhere, there's $2 billion here for this, there's a couple of $1 billion for roads, there's the new family support package, there's always something, there's just money coming out. That seems counterintuitive with a cost of living crisis where households are having to trim their budgets. The government just seems to keep on spending more. And that comes up in the stats that this is genuinely one of the highest spending governments in recent times.
Well, it's the highest spending government this country has ever seen. And $2 billion doesn't get you what it used to. And that's part of the problem. Inflation has helped the budget a lot through bracket creep. And this government, as Stephen just alluded to, has been out there spending it. They have actually had the opportunity to do what governments in Australia have been doing for the last 40 years, and that's get back to balance sustainably. But the thing that's really changed with this government is they've completely thrown out the Charter of Budget Honesty, and there is no ambition to return the budget to balance at any stage in the future, maybe 10 years down the track, which is just mythology. So, yeah, they are throwing money around. And, of course, the big issue is that structural shift in the size of government in our economy, which is the biggest we have seen since the late 60s, early 70s, is going to have tremendous implications and is having tremendous implications for the rest of us. It is squeezing out everyone else. And you're seeing that in the labour market, this narrative that the public sector spending and the public sector generation of jobs is saving the economy from recession in the face of a weak private sector simply doesn't bear out the reality of the matter. They're squeezing the private sector out.
So I want to put it to you that this government, which you might have had hopes for a Labor government being a reforming type Hawke-Keating style government where it, sort of privatises things and really tries to address, sort of issues with the business sector. In many ways, it's become as much a centralised government as we have seen in recent times. And that, in many ways, is of concern to the business community.
Well, yeah, and it is a reforming government because they are changing our society and economy in ways that are completely at odds with what we've been doing for the last 40 years. Hawke and Keating reformed this economy, from top to toe to allow market signals and market prices to be the main driver of what happens in our economy. And they are walking that back. And so they are reforming. It's just that it's reforming in a way that a lot of people don't think of reform. We think of reform, particularly us economists, as a way to make the economy more efficient, to make the allocation of resources more effective, and of course take advantage of technology and all this sort of stuff. What we've been doing for 40 years, they aren't doing this. They are centralising, as you say. They are big government. And of course, all these jobs that are being generated in health and social assistance, which is their care economy initiative, are phenomenal quantum. It's the biggest employer in the economy by a mile. But it's destroying productivity in our economy and living standards for everyone. So that's the question I think has to be asked of the Treasurer and the Prime Minister is, What are you going to do about productivity? What are you going to do about the living standards of all Australians?
I was going to ask Stephen Hamilton exactly that question, because here is the chart looking at the compensation of employees on a quarterly basis, which you can see remains very, very high, but it's also the share of the employment market that government now represents, both state and federal. We know of the spending spree that the states have gone on, that it risks their credit ratings right now. But that is a fundamental problem about a centralised sort of economy, a more centralised government-controlled economy.
Yeah, since the government was elected, government spending as a share of GDP has gone from about 24.5, which was its long-run average. It hovered around there for decades, and it's jumped right up to 27.5. So that's the fastest run-up in government spending since the Whitlam government. Now, yes, Warren and I are very concerned about inflation. We're very concerned about interest rates. We're concerned about the short-term macroeconomic management, and it matters for that. But there's a bigger problem, which is ultimately governments can help determine the long-run growth trajectory of the economy. And that over decades is really what determines our standard of living, right? And every dollar we move from the private sector to the public sector, we've got to pay for that. We've got to pay for that with taxes that act like a handbrake on our economy, right? So, I am genuinely quite concerned about the long-run growth prospects for Australia with government spending that I think is not well designed. It's not super efficient. It's not well targeted. We get a huge amount of waste in things like the NDIS. We've had massive amount of waste in defence in history. So if we don't sort of get that public side of our economy working more efficiently and restrain it to the degree we can, as Warren said, I think it will come at a huge cost to the private sector and ultimately to our living standards. Because
everybody talks productivity, but you can also talk competitiveness. Because the fact of the matter is, with energy policy driving up the price of energy, with wages policies that drive up the price of wages, with tax policy that leaves Australia's taxes much higher than they are overseas, Australia's private sector, being crowded out by government, makes its choice and says, we can make more money in America. We're going to shift capital to the United States rather than leave it in Australia because it's a bigger market and we can make more money there.
Yeah, so when I said in the current financial year, the government has taken $21 billion of spending decisions, imagine what $21 billion could have bought us in making our tax system more competitive, right? Imagine the kind of investment incentives we could have put in place. Imagine the personal income tax rates we could have in place. We could have done generational reform to our kind of capital income tax system. We could have done all sorts of things that would have made our economy more productive, raised our GDP per capita, made us all richer. But instead, we've chosen an alternative path. And so, we have to be constantly thinking as economists about that opportunity cost. What was the alternative that we gave up? $21 billion in a single year is a truly extraordinary amount of money, more than stage 3 tax cuts cost, for example. And we just kind of frittered it away over a few years without really thinking about its consequences. And I think if we keep doing that year after year after year, we're going to run into serious trouble. I mean, I've said, the former Singaporean Prime Minister said that we'll become the poor white trash of Asia. And I think, if we keep on this track, that's exactly what we'll be.
I'll tell you, this is one of the really interesting things for Jim Chalmers, in particular delivering the budget, where the cost of living is an issue that still confronts people. Inflation might have come down, but that doesn't mean prices have come down. And this is going to be the big trouble for the government trying to deliver, because every time there seems to be a problem, the government seems to turn up and say, listen, we've got plenty of money, we'll try and solve your problem. And that is not really the answer long term.
Yeah, and the problem they've got politically is that people are going to see that it's not actually working. That is, these temporary one-off payments, whether it's energy or rent or whatever.
Because, and just to jump in there, because the prosperity of Australians is going backwards.
Well, it's because the cost of living crisis is still there, because they're failing to address the underlying problem, which is an inflation cost pressure in our community driven by a combination of really stimulatory fiscal policy, massive government spending, and of course, I think probably interest rates that aren't quite high enough. But whatever the argument of the policy mix, the fact is people are, this idea that inflation's come down, the printed CPI is mythology. They've poisoned that with these subsidies. Inflation is running at 3 to 3.5. You go back 10, 15 years, if we'd had inflation of that level, any of our other central banks would be, having nightmares about how much they've got to raise rates, and we're cutting rates, and inflation's above target. And the reality is for Australians, the cost of their food bill every week, their cost of their electricity every quarter, excluding the subsidies, is not going down. And so the government throws all this stuff saying it's cost of living relief, but people know it's not changing. Their living standards are still going down. And another part of this, which the government will not talk about, is bracket creep. Their tax burden for the middle part of Australia is getting larger. So that's a big player in how all Australians are feeling less well off.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it, when you go there, Stephen, because normally if you've got a 4.1% unemployment rate, which Australia has, there should be prosperity. People should feel good. But the reality is that people are not feeling good at the moment, and that kind of turns up in a lot of the opinion polls.
Yeah, so, I mean, the positive side of the government story is that they have the strongest labour market just about in Australian history, right? It is extraordinary. We have an all-time record employment level, and we have a very low unemployment level, right? We're right around 4%. It's hard to imagine it sustainably below that level. It's well below what the RBA, for example, assumes is sustainable. So, that strong labour market is great. It does potentially, open the possibility for wage growth. It does obviously bring people into the workforce, and that's great for them. But we have to ask ourselves what the cost of that was and whether we got the balance right. And so, the RBA runs a sort of full employment target with its inflation target. It's meant to manage both of those targets. It's nailed the employment target, right? Nailed it right on, as low as it could possibly be, but at a very significant cost of living standards over the last 3 years, right? We have a sort of a 10% reduction in people's disposable income. We've got a 20% increase in the price level. So I think, particularly the RBA has to do some serious soul searching, I think, over the coming years as to whether they got that balance right, what the costs were. And of course, the government needs to think hard about whether it made the situation worse, which, I think Warren agrees. I think the evidence shows is pretty clearly the case.
Indeed. Stephen Hamilton in Washington, many thanks for your time. And Warren Hogan here in the studio as well. Many thanks for your time as well.
Thanks, Ross.